Before I start on this video, I want to make it clear to you guys that I do not support factory farming at all. It ears me to know that we are bailing them out. Even in the HERA bill, we're bailing them out. I think that factory farming is a very, very bad thing. I don't buy their meat, but I make a personal choice not to buy their meat, not to support them. This video is not in favor of factory farming. I'm going to be talking about some factory farms here in the state of North Carolina and talking about why the attacks on these farms are bad. And it's not about the factory farms. If that's all you get out of this video, you're not listening to what I'm saying. What they're doing is they're using advocacy. They're using what people feel is unjust, and they're using all of those feelings that you have. They're using the fact that China owns these hog farms to put them out of business. But in order to do so, they're changing the law. They're changing the law that takes away independence of property owners. And that is what is important out of this video. We often see advocacy used to change laws, and it's wrong. It shouldn't be used. When these laws go into place, they change more than a factory farm. If you want to shut down a factory farm, the way you do it is you stop subsidizing the industry. You stop using our tax dollars to keep them in business. You stop calling them critical for our food supply chain. You pass things like the Prime Act to allow people to go to custom processing facilities and sell their meat. You allow people to prosper as small farmers, but you don't enact laws that prohibit that. And that is everything that they're going to do. In this video, I'm going to discuss everything from the small farmer to these factory farms and how these laws are impacting them. And that's what you need to pay attention to, is the underlying laws. As citizens of this country, we have a bad habit of jumping on social bandwagons and not paying attention to the consequences. We need to start paying attention to the consequences, or we're going to lose all of our independence. Farms can be very majestic places. They are basically small little ecosystems in and of themselves. And I realize that not every farm is pretty to look at, but without farms, we might not have much of an ecosystem left. At least not much of an ecosystem with biodiversity. And so farms are very important. The average farm size in the United States, though, is only about 444 acres. And I know that sounds like a lot of land, but when you consider that that is the average and only 8% are the top producers in the United States, the rest of the farms are actually pretty small. In fact, 50% of the farms in America produce less than $10,000 a year in annual revenue. But still, the small farm concept is something that I saw growing considerably when I was in real estate. A lot of people would contact me and they wanted between 15 and 20 acres to start a small family farm, raise some cows. For the most part, these farms are self-sustainability, but sometimes they produce some excess that they are then able to sell. Sometimes people will buy 15 or 20 acres and try and overproduce in order to make an income off of it, and it can end up hurting the land a little bit. But those are choices that individuals are making. Today, with the coronavirus, more and more people are becoming aware of self-sustainability. They're becoming more aware of the need to buy local and support their local farmers. And so you're starting to see a shift of thought that says, we need more local farmers, we need to buy local food, we need to stop the inhumane practices of factory farms, and we need to buy land ourselves. That shift of thought is a great shift of thought, but unfortunately, you cannot depend on your right to farm.
Did the governor of Michigan just canceled gardening for the month. They shut down gardening centers. There's even a spot in the order that says that if you are, like, let's say Home Depot or a farm store or Walmart or something like that, they either have to remove gardening products from the stores, from the shelves. They either need to remove them or they need to cordon off the areas so that people cannot go and shop in those areas. So I was a little surprised by this. This is kind of a new part to that order. I had some plans to go and buy some fruit trees and get some things started around here. If all the nurseries, greenhouses, and other places are shut down and I need to buy supplies or other places need to buy supplies, they can't. And so that's going to be a little interesting over the next 3 weeks. So that means into May, May 1st would be the first time that we could go out and purchase gardening stuff and supplies. And so that's, we'll have to be creative around here for a little while.
In fact, a farmer cannot depend on their right to farm.
Quite honestly, I'm living under the false impression. I thought farmers here had a right to farm. I thought that they were unencumbered in terms of their growth, their crops and all that. What's the problem?
That's really not the case.
Every state in the United States has enacted a right to farm law.
The right to farm bill. When I heard that with no other knowledge about what it was or what it had to do with, I thought, this is something up. Anything that sounds as innocent as the right to farm bill is definitely involved in various nefarious chaos. I knew it from my cranium down to my labia that something was amiss, all right? And my labia has never been wrong. I mean, right to farm? Who even needs a right to farm written in the law? Who's trying to stop family farms? Like, a lot of people just running around angrily yanking up yams out of the ground, pulling pickles off of trees and going, how dare you? You and your kumquats will have to answer to the Lord.
And that right to farm law protects the farmers against nuisance lawsuits that could put them out of business, completely bankrupt them and take their land.
It establishes essentially, if I was here farming, the things that go with farming and ranching, dust, odor, etc., are not reason, as long as what I'm doing on the farm isn't outside of normal practice, doesn't constitute a nuisance.
But these lawsuits in recent years have increased, and the reason why that they have increased is because they've found loopholes in the laws in order to be able to sue the farmers. And so there are groups that in particular will go out and purposefully sue the farmers. And these groups are often backed by advocate groups. I wouldn't say that they're backed by advocate groups because they're more or less fronting the advocate groups to push the lawsuits. The groups that are actually behind it, the money trail that goes behind it, has nothing to do with any type of advocacy. And I'm going to explain to you what their motive is and what's actually going on and why you cannot depend on your right to farm. I think that in North Carolina, hog farm nuisance lawsuits are a perfect example because they won $500 million. They actually shut farmers out of business who had been in their family farm for over 30 years, some of them for generations. And these lawsuits were able to shut them down. Now in 2013, Pat McCrory, who was the governor of North Carolina at the time, had moved to put a cap on what you could seek from punitive damages from farms in a nuisance complaint. And because of that cap, that $500 million that was awarded was actually reduced to $97.8 million, which was just enough probably to pay the special interest groups and attorneys involved in the suit. I'm not sure that the individuals, there were 500 individuals, 26 different cases originally against 89 farms. I'm not sure that those 500 individuals really received a whole lot of those millions of dollars, but I'm sure that they got enough money to make them happy and do it again. But Curlis traced this money trail back, and if you follow the money trail, it loops you around to a lot of familiar faces that are always trying to accomplish the same thing. And none of these faces are vegans, none of these faces are animal advocates. These faces are individuals who prey off of vegans and animal advocates. So when you're trying to pass a policy, when you're trying to change a society, the best way to do that is through advocacy. You can use advocates because advocates are so passionate about what they're doing that they forget about where the sourcing is coming from to support their progress. And they become easily controlled and manipulated, and that's what they did in this case. And I think it's a very bad thing. I don't think that we should be taking, a movement like veganism, where people are willing to put their health aside because of something that they believe in and weaponize it. But that's basically what these politicians and elite individuals have done. They're weaponizing vegans, and they're even trying to change the term vegan. Vegan nowadays is starting to represent something other than somebody who doesn't eat meat. It represents somebody who is holistic to their environment, even though they don't support the entire biological system. Somebody who is just super green.
Even you have to admit, Oscar, things are really messed up right now.
Oh, I know, and I love it.
You do?
Sure.
It's been rebranded into a trendy term with many definitions. In fact, if you read up on vegan blogs, they praise the fact that Mark Zuckerberg only eats what he could kill, because not that he's not eating meat, but because he's doing something that they feel is more sustainable. And that's how they're rebranding vegans, because vegans by themselves weren't a strong enough tool to weaponize. So now they're weaponizing it a little more. They've changed the definition. They're branding it a little better. And now they've got this group of advocates that they can put out there. And the same goes for animal rights. They're actually trying to put them all under one umbrella right now.
Hey, how's it going? Good. Oh, you getting wet out there?
Not too bad.
Not anymore. How's it going?
Good, how are you?
Amazing.
Did you just take that out of one of the...
I stole it from Starbucks, but I'm just borrowing it.
Wait.
Hey, what's up? Sorry.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Hey.
Yeah, hi.
You're gonna walk us all the way to Kappa?
Yeah.
No. That is sad. You're not gonna walk us all the way.
I'm a sad little man.
But you have to realize that there are animal rights advocates and then there are animal abolitionists. What they're actually weaponizing are both, but I think that the animal rights advocates have slowly started to step out of the loop, because they're realizing that what they're actually doing is not better for the animals. When you go and depopulate farm animals and livestock, you're not actually doing something that is humane, because there is no laws against how you depopulate in extremities, and we know this from recent statements of the USDA. When they depopulate, they do it whatever is quick and efficient for the farmer. They're trying to depopulate something that to help balance out the economy. A lot of these measures that are being taken by some of these animal rights groups to push for this type of action to be taken is not actually provoking humane practices on the animals. Is actually doing quite the opposite. It's a very inhumane process of depopulating. It's not culling, it's not processing, it's depopulating. There's different words for everything that you'll learn mean different things. So these animals aren't going onto the shelves in the grocery stores. These animals are just being put away with whatever means is necessary and fast and efficient for the farmer. Anyway, I was getting off subject there a little bit, but I think that there's a lot to all this that a lot of people don't understand. And I think that when people realize that their advocacy is being used, they're not going to like it. And it's going to backfire on those using them. And if it doesn't, and they continue to use those resources, for example, a lot of these groups, the heads of these nonprofits, for these advocacies, they're making six-figure incomes. They're making six-figure incomes because of extremely large donations that are being made to their foundations and to their general operating budgets. And so they're going to continue to push, and they're going to continue to use their advocates to help the cause of these individuals because they're getting their pockets lined. A lot of this has to do with money, and we'll get into that. And so what is actually going to happen is that people are going to turn on those advocacy groups. The advocates themselves may end up turning on those groups. A perfect example of somebody in history who used advocacy as a cause to generate a movement to cause a substantial amount of political change would be somebody like Hitler. Hitler used advocacy. He was half Jewish, but he turned people against the Jews. And it was all basically to gain power and control, to change the state into a government system that he thought was necessary. We all know it happened to Hitler. So with the North Carolina lawsuits, what happened with these 89 farms that were getting sued, there was another twist to this, and that is that they attacked a subsidy of Smithfield Foods, which at the time had just sold to Smithfield Foods, it had just sold to China. So Smithfield Foods sold in 2013. These lawsuits started popping up in 2014 and 2015. The timing was almost perfect for them because they had something else going on their side. A lot of people don't like the fact that China now owns that meat processor. China now owns the largest pork processor in the United States. People didn't like that. It didn't sit well with a lot of people. It's probably one of the biggest mistakes Smithfield Foods has ever made, except for once they sold it to China. I don't think they really cared. The name, the brand, it's a different company. It's now Chinese owned. So you have this Chinese owned operation in the United States. The thing is that Smithfield Foods, the hog farms that were getting sold, the subsidy is American owned. And so they were suing an American company that was a subsidy of a Chinese company. And so that's where things get a little muddled. The other side of this is that all of the independent farmers, so that subsidy doesn't own all of the farms. That subsidy controls most of the farms, and it is partially owned by China because it is a subsidy of Smithfield Foods, but it is not entirely owned. And then all of the independent farms are owned by North Carolina farmers. The hogs are all owned by Smithfield. The feed that feeds the hogs are all owned by Smithfield. I think you know the factory farming, the way things work in factory farming. It's the same with chicken farms. The farmer doesn't own the chickens, they don't own the flock, they don't own the feed. They basically have a system that comes through their chicken house, and it tells them how they operate it and everything that they need to do, and then they get paid on the outside. And we do something similar with feed cattle, where you can basically have cattle come to your property. They are weighed at the time they come onto the land, they're weighed at the time they come off the land, and you get paid based on their growth while they are on your property, but the cattle are completely owned by somebody else. So this isn't something that is completely new. This is a method of farming that's been around for quite some time, and it's something that's very big with factory farms. The corporation owns the animals, the feed, the operation. You basically just operate it as the farmer, and you get a paycheck when you do your job correctly. They're really not self-employed. They have to operate under somebody else's schedule. But they do own the land. They take all the risk on the land, on the buildings. That's their investment. And so when they get sued, that's what they're losing. They're losing their entire investment into this system. So a lot of these groups that were suing over pollution and animal rights and the impact that it had on the surrounding neighbors. Now, it didn't change the fact that there were many surrounding neighbors who had lived there for many years who felt that the farms had a strong benefit to their society. Some of the individuals suing lived a mile or two away from the actual hog farms. They didn't live next door to them. Some of them did, but they were kind of a diverse group within the community. Whoever they could get to file into the lawsuit was who they got to file into the lawsuit. And for a lot of people who live near a hog farm or a chicken farm or somewhere in that nature, they're not necessarily the wealthiest people. And so when you have an opportunity for them to make a lot of money, that gives them an incentive to sign on to the lawsuit. A lot of people will sign on to a class action lawsuit just to get that $2 check in the mail maybe in 3 or 4 years. I don't understand it personally, but that's just the way the world works. Anyway, so they sued the farms. In the lawsuit, though, and if you read through this lawsuit, it's a very interesting lawsuit. Both sides presented arguments. One side was allowed to present scientific evidence. The other side was not allowed to bring in scientific evidence. The scientific evidence that was brought in by the plaintiffs, and it wasn't even believable. In fact, in the judge's own words, he doesn't see how it could be good for people's respiratory systems. He doesn't see how it could possibly be good for the environment. It was very clear from his statements that he didn't see how it could be. It's not that it was proven that it couldn't be. That didn't matter to the judge. And this is where we're going to get into the roots of this case in a few minutes here. And animal welfare didn't care that much for the judge. In fact, he called pigs ugly in his closing statements. He was making arguments to appease the advocates. But one of the arguments that he made, and he made very clear to everybody in the courtroom, was that less fortunate fellow citizens have property rights too. Many of the homes surrounding an operation of this sort don't go for a high price. And I wouldn't disagree with that. I would say that everybody has the right to property ownership. They also bought that property knowing that they were buying a property near a hog farm. When we bought our farm and we moved out into the country, we knew that there were other farms nearby. I knew that I was going to hear the cows on the thousands of acres of cows that are behind us. I knew that I was going to smell the chicken house every 6 months. I knew that there would be chicken trucks driving down the road. I knew that there would be feed trucks and tractors driving down the road. I knew that there was a soil facility through the woods, and that whenever they turned their fields, I would smell a mucky smell in the afternoon. I knew that all of these things happen in the countryside, and I still bought my house. After this particular lawsuit was filed in North Carolina, the legislature moved very quickly to change the law, because the way that they won this lawsuit was by manipulating the wording of the right to farm law. The right to farm law protected farms against nuisance complaints in the event of changes in or outside of the farm, fundamental changes that would have to occur. Well, if somebody owned a residence, for example, I own a residence, we have a farm, but if I just called this place a residence and I didn't do anything with my land, about 2 miles down the road in one direction, I have a chicken farm, and every 6 months they clean those chicken houses out, and man, that can reek sometimes if the wind's blowing in this direction, which every other year it is. And then about a mile in the other direction, we have a facility that takes compost materials, everything from restaurants. It takes all the stuff from all over the state, from restaurants and things, and then it composts them and recycles them into usable soil. And it's actually pretty good soil. It's the soil that we use when we grow our gardens. It could be a little rich in the first year, but then after the first year, the nutrient content breaks down a little bit, and plants grow fantastically in it. But when they turn their fields and stuff, it stinks. It doesn't matter if I eat their product. I don't eat soil, but it doesn't matter if I use their product. For example, I use their soil. I don't like the smell. When they turn their fields, I don't like the smell. So under the previous law, nothing's changed. I have a house, they have a farm, but it's a nuisance to me. I could sue them for that, and I could sue the dickens out of them and shut them down. And that's how it worked, is that they weren't making any fundamental changes. I wasn't making fundamental changes, and therefore there was no fundamental change and there was no protection on the law, and that left it open for the ability to sue for punitive damages. And that was essentially where the judge was going with this. It doesn't matter to him when you bought your house, because this was a collective suit. So there were people involved with the suits that didn't live there for very long. There were some people involved in the suits that lived there longer than the farming operation, or the property had been in their family for longer than the farming operation, because some of these farming operations were several generations. But they found that loophole. They found that reasoning that the judge could agree with, that there was no fundamental change and therefore they are not protected under the farm nuisance law. So in North Carolina, they moved to change the farm nuisance law. Now the farm nuisance law says that after the farm has been in operation for a year, you can't bring a complaint against it. And you can't bring a complaint against it unless there's been a criminal charge against the farm, and it's been at least 3 years after those charges have been brought against the farm. It basically makes it almost impossible to sue the farm, and then when you do sue the farm, the punitive damages are so low, it's not worth the time or the money. But for these guys, it wasn't about the time or the money to begin with, so I'm not sure that that's necessarily going to protect them. They didn't care about the environmental aspects of it, about the animal rights. What they cared about was a definition of property rights.
Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez making more headlines. This time it's her latest demand that home ownership should be, quote, legislated as a human right. She says the right to have a home is more important than someone's right to make a profit. So, is home ownership a right?
No, I don't think it is. I think being able to find affordable, decent housing is probably something that everyone in this country should have access to. But honestly, one by one, whether it's college or housing or whatever, we're taking away the responsibility of the individual to provide for themselves and their family. I think that is the most undermining thing we could do in our society, and we're doing it every day.
And that is where the right to farm law becomes extremely interesting in the years ahead, because we are now facing this in political conversations nonstop. Are your rights to property?
Your needs are, I mean, what is a right? A right is the right to act. It's the right to action. So this whole idea that you have a right to health care, housing, education, all that's got to be paid for, created by someone else. You know, when the founders talked about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, they talked about your own pursuit of those values, not simply having them handed to you by force by others.
There are two fundamental thought processes between property rights. One is that you have the right to go out and earn an income. You have a right to purchase property, and on that property you have the right to put up fences, to raise your own livestock, to prevent others from hunting on it. Those are all rights that you have as an individual who have earned and purchased your land, your property. You have unlimited rights to make income off of that property. The right to farm law gives you the ability to farm your land and grow food, grow vegetables, grow livestock, and sell it for an income. You have the right to buy property, become self-sufficient, not just from a food source, but from an income source. The flip side to this right to property argument: everybody has the right to land. Everybody has the right to self-sustainability. If you can't own the land yourself, you have the right to access other people's land. It's kind of the forest and foraging concept. You have the right to come onto somebody else's land to hunt for your food. You have the right to come onto somebody else's land to collect wood, because it's a natural resource to burn in your stoves. You have the right to come on somebody else's land to collect berries, to forage, to get whatever it is that you need to be sustainable. Under this right, everybody has the right to private property, because everybody has the right to a home. But nobody has right to hoard land. Nobody has the right to say you cannot come on my land. Nobody has the right to say there is no hunting on my land, there is no fishing on my land. You do not have the right to control your land. The resources of the land become the rights of the commons. But under the rights of the commons, everybody has access to land. Everybody has rights to land. Everybody has rights to their own private property, which isn't real property. That would be like your car. There are two different fundamental reasonings behind how we handle property rights, and there are good distinctions between the two. And while I don't support the commons distinction, because I don't know if any of you have ever read The Tragedy of the Commons, but that is a prime example of when a resource is given unlimitedly to the population, and everybody takes it to their own personal use. They're taking it to their own personal use over the detriment of others.
Of course, none of us are greedy. It's only the other fellow who's greedy.
Whereas in a private ownership situation, the private owner can manage their property and they're going to keep it up, and they don't have the overusage of the general public coming onto their property against their will. Could you imagine if you had land like ours? We have deer all over these hills every night, people coming out and just shooting at them with our kids in the house. And could you imagine being responsible for this land, owning the land and owning the cows and the livestock and everything on the land, and somebody coming onto your land to hunt, and then they're run over by a bull? Then you get sued because you have land that belongs to the commons, even though you paid for it and you have your livestock on it. And not to mention that somebody else could bring their bull over and put it on your land and say that they have the right to graze the land. You can see where this becomes a very touchy situation for a lot of people. And it is a touchy situation because there are a lot of people who believe that the land should belong to the commons. And I've heard this even with Native Americans. Native Americans believe nobody should own the land. But that's not necessarily true either. And if you look at the history of commons laws, they date back to the early days of Ireland. They date back to Native Americans, even though Native Americans didn't necessarily have laws. A law is something that is a respected formality in a way for them. And they had tribes. And if you don't think those tribes didn't get into it over their territorial rights, you are absolutely wrong. Brown Mountain in North Carolina is a historical mountain, a historical battlefield amongst Native Americans before we ever landed on this soil. And it was over territorial rights. In Ireland and all these places where you had kind of these communal laws, the difference between that and an entire nation is that they acted within tribes. The Celtic community acted within tribes, communal groups. And they also did fight over territory. But for the most part, they respected each other's territory, and these groups or families and circles that managed a particular territory, they managed it for small inhabitants, a small group of people. And they did have rules and regulations. Now, the commons concept today is much different because we're taking an entire nation. And in order to control that land, because if you don't control it, if you don't put policies in place, what happens is the tragedy of the commons. And so what they end up doing is they make everything public owned, and the word public means government. The government owns it, the government regulates it, now the government has control over it. So the government says you can hunt X number of deer a year, you can hunt X number of X, Y, and Z a year. You can do it wherever you want to, and you can graze wherever you want to, and you can till the land and grow crops wherever you want to, but you can only do X amount per year. You can only do this, you can only do that. If we need to shut it down, we can shut it down. So we've seen a similar situation with the coronavirus. You no longer have the right to own a business and operate a business. The government controls that right because it's good for the commons.
The world runs on individuals pursuing their separate interests. The great achievements of civilization have not come from government bureaus. Einstein didn't construct his theory under order from a bureaucrat. Henry Ford didn't revolutionize the automobile industry that way. In the only cases in which the masses have escaped from the kind of grinding poverty you're talking about, the only cases in recorded history or where they have had capitalism and largely free trade.
So this pandemic has actually given us a pretty good glimpse into what happens when everything is controlled by the commons, by the public. You no longer have the right to operate a business. These lawsuits were against the businesses. They weren't against animal cruelty. They weren't against environmentalism. They didn't care about that information. In fact, they didn't even allow the scientific information into the courtroom. That's not what this was about. This was about shutting it down, the individual's right to grow and prosper on private property. This is an attack that we see over and over again.
Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren unveiling a shocking new proposal that would nationalize every major business in America. The new legislation, called the Accountable Capitalism Act, would constitute the largest seizure of private property in human history. So what would it do to our economy? What would it look like with the government in charge of our largest corporations? Let's ask the CEO of Walzer Wealth Management, Rebecca Walzer. Good morning, Rebecca.
Good morning, and thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. What's your immediate reaction to this idea that all of a sudden the government would nationalize all these companies?
Well, I'm glad that she's bold enough to actually tell us exactly what she wants, because now we can call a spade a spade. This is definitely socialism, because socialism is public ownership of companies where all the profits are actually redistributed to stakeholders instead of shareholders.
Elizabeth Warren has implemented a strategy in her presidential campaign for the new farm, which is basically this concept of the government owning the land. They own the crops. They control the price inflation of the crops. They control when the price goes up, when the price goes down. There's absolutely no profitability for the individual. In a commons law concept, everybody has rights to sustain themselves, and everybody is given enough income to have the things to sustain themselves. But nobody has the right to be a profiteer. Nobody has the right to be anything other than a commons. And the way that it ends up working is that an elite few have control over the commons. And there's actually, in this lawsuit, there were several investors. One was the co-founder of Facebook. He kind of funds a lot of the animal rights groups that came into the lawsuits. The other one is a partner of Warren Buffett. He kind of funds the environmental activism side and the groups that come in for that side of the lawsuits. And then Eric Schmidt funds the legal side of it. And that's where this gets very interesting, because as we know, the evidence behind the environmental impacts and the animal impacts did not matter to the judge, nor did they matter to Governor Roy Cooper, who very distinctly said that we needed to take an attack against businesses over the people. And as he has done quite well with his quarantine measures, which haven't even really worked. Our numbers are still skyrocketing even though he quarantined. Eric Schmidt is involved with an organization called New America. New America was founded by both a Republican and a Democrat, arguably not a very conservative Republican, but it's more of a left-wing elite think tank in Washington, D.C. And what they try and do is come up with policies, because their mentality is people don't have the ability to manage and govern themselves. They have all sorts of different interesting articles, from property rights to everything else on their website. They're supposed to be, a think tank that is not manipulated by their investors. And who are their investors? Well, the largest investor of this think tank is Bill Gates. Between the Gates Foundation and then the Pilot Foundation, which is Melinda Gates' foundation, that's where most of the funding to this think tank comes from. And then the Schmidt family and Google, and actually the State Department under Hillary, I think one year they donated nearly $3 million. And even now they continue to donate, around $500,000, something like that, every now and then. So they're a voice for the elite. And they believe in the concept that the general public needs the elite to lead.
We do believe that to whom much is given, much is expected.
And that is where, when you get into these commons laws, that is exactly what we're doing. We're taking away the commoner's right to grow and prosper. We're giving them the right to live, but that's it. And we're leaving that right to the elite few who have the better sense of how to manage them.
That might have more negatives than positives, but I may have a distorted view of this.
And for a politician, this is how it works. Politicians are individuals. This is what makes you and I non-politicians. Politicians are individuals who believe that they can manage the lives of others better than they can independently manage them. And constituents are people who believe that somebody else can manage their life better than they can.
From time to time, we've been tempted to believe that society has become too complex to be managed by self-rule, that government by an elite group is superior to government for, by, and of the people. Well, if no one among us is capable of governing himself, then who among us has the capacity to govern someone else?
There is no reason why you, as an independent person, should ever believe that somebody else with the equal capacity that you have to gain knowledge and learn and live should have a better say in how you live your life, raise your family, than you do.
And what does reward virtue? You think the communist commissar rewards virtue? You think a Hitler rewards virtue? You think, excuse me, if you'll pardon me, do you think American presidents reward virtue? Do they choose their appointees on the basis of the virtue of the people appointed, or on the basis of their political clout? Is it really true that political self-interest is nobler somehow than economic self-interest? I think you're taking a lot of things for granted. And just tell me where in the world you find these angels who are going to organize society for us. Well, I don't even trust you to do that.
But for whatever reason, we believe this. And the reason why we believe it is because these people are putting out search results and publications that make you believe it.
One way to think about this is that this 1 month, 2 months period has brought forth 10 years of forward change. So all of a sudden, the internet is no longer optional. It's fundamental to doing business, to operate, to live our lives.
I don't think I have to remind you that democratic socialist states include Russia, China, and North Korea. I know what you're thinking. I thought North Korea was a dictatorship too. But the truth is that these are states in which they have commons laws for commons. The people have the rights to do certain things, but the government controls it all, and that government is controlled by an elite few. Our country is a little different. It was founded off of independence, Constitution of Independence.
That they, not government, are to have control of their own affairs to the greatest extent possible with an orderly society.
The ability of the American people to be independent, to have independent liberty, to have independent rights. It doesn't mean that we have the right to go out and pollute the waterways that affect other people, but it does mean that we have the right to buy land and prosper off of that land, to grow a business on that land.
If you want to know where the masses are worst off, it's exactly in the kinds of societies that depart from that. So that the record of history is absolutely crystal clear, that there is no alternative way so far discovered of improving the lot of the ordinary people that can hold a candle to the productive activities that are unleashed by a free enterprise system.
That right of independence has slowly been hacked away at year after year after year, with more and more policies transferring most of that independent right back to the elite few who operate our government. This push to this new farm economic policy, the push towards renewable energy, the push towards a lot of these things. You know, renewable energy isn't necessarily more humane or better for the environment either, and I'll do a completely different video on solar panels. Very interesting stuff. At the end of the day, the shift is a move to further take that independence and to further put things into the hands of the government, because they don't see how, with population growth, we can possibly be sustainable with independent liberties. That's what it all comes down to, independent liberties. Do you have the right to manage yourself, or should we manage that right for you? If we manage that right for you, we will earn all of the income, we will take all of the opportunity, but you will have everything that is necessary for you and nothing more. Because if you have more, you are infringing upon the rights of others. You're utilizing more resources than what other people have.
And here's the deal. They should have a minimum tax of 15%.
I raise taxes.
I believe in democratic socialism for working people.
I think it's interesting that the groups that are funding the legal side of these arguments are groups that are directly associated with elitism, with common laws, with communalism. And they are groups that are fighting for it every day as hard as they possibly can. And they are groups that are led by individuals who became as successful as they are by opportunity that was given to them in an independent liberty system. The hypocrisy doesn't stop there though, because most of these individuals are not vegans. And they're pitching these fights against these farms as a fight against animal cruelty, as a fight against eating animal agriculture. But none of them are actually vegans. Bill Gates, for example, loves burgers. He's never actually said he was a vegan, by the way. He likes burgers, he likes steaks, he said that publicly. If you go and have lunch with Bill Gates, according to his general manager, you're most likely going to be eating a cheeseburger. As we know, Ocasio-Cortez eats cheeseburgers because after she came out with the new Green Deal and told everybody else not to eat cheeseburgers, people took pictures of her eating cheeseburgers in a restaurant. All of these people love their meat products as well. Heck, even the CEO of Amazon likes to eat octopus for breakfast. Of all the weird things, but I guess octopus is a good part of your Mediterranean diet if you can afford it. Then you've got people like Mark Zuckerberg who eat only what they can kill. And the vegan movement has, made a big deal out of that. He's doing something that is less inhumane by eating only what he can kill. But I will argue that if we had everybody just go out and kill the animals that they eat, there would be no humanitarian slaughter act to protect those animals. They would do it whatever way they felt suited to. And then there's really no control over who gets that meat, because if I shared that meat with my neighbor and then he paid me down the road for something else, yes, that's illegal, but there's really no oversight for that. But they all have one thing in common. They've all invested in companies like Beyond Meat and Impossible Burgers. In fact, the co-founder of Facebook is one of the founders of Beyond Meat. Eric Schmidt tried to get Google to buy Beyond Meat. All of these people who are bringing these lawsuits against meat farmers, agricultural farmers, are people who are invested in the vegan meat industry and aren't even vegans. Go figure. That's an interesting concept to me. It's all about money in this situation. If they can shut down the competition, they can grow their pool of funds a little better. And regardless of all of the publishing that comes out about the growth of fake meat products, without the coronavirus, there wouldn't have been nearly as much growth as there was this year. The market was slowing down before the coronavirus. They were having trouble getting people to buy their product because a lot of people just don't want the fake stuff. People don't want lab-grown meat. People don't want vegetables that have been fermented with other proteins to create a fake burger. When we talk about fermentation, yes, fermentation in cooking is a process, but it's also a process in chemicalization. And so what they're actually doing in these labs is a chemicalization process to bond foods and create things, and which is why Whole Foods doesn't necessarily sell the Beyond Burger, or they don't agree with the Beyond Burgers because it's overly processed. Chipotle turned it down from their menu because it's overly processed. Overly processed means it's no longer a whole food, and they support the whole food concept, which I heavily support as well. It doesn't mean that I don't eat processed foods every now and then, but I try and create a diet based on whole foods. We all should try and do that because the processed stuff is chemically processed. It's caused chemical reactions with the food that is unnatural to our bodies to consume and digest and break down. There's a lot of money in this industry. So they expected in 2014 it was a $3 billion industry. By 2025 it should be a $25 billion industry. That's a significant growth for an investor. So now you have these investors who have started this stuff up. They want to see that growth. They want to see that milestone. They take out the competition by using activist groups to take out the competition. Meanwhile, they're aligning their products. And what's very interesting about this is they've started a vegan ETF. If you look at the top holdings of the vegan ETF, it is what? Alphabet Inc., Microsoft, Apple, Facebook. The top holdings of this company, of this ETF, that vegans are now funding and activists getting behind this stuff are saying, I want my money invested into this ETF because it's going to outperform, because that's the future of America. Because they were told that by these individuals who run the companies who are the top holdings of the ETF. But yet, they are pushing for policies that say you do not have the right to prosper. I would encourage all of you, when you go out this year to vote, to look at these individuals and say no to everybody that will vote for the bills that they're trying to pass. I'm going to get into more detail on FSRA, which has been introduced by Elizabeth Warren, as well as the Green Deal in the next couple of videos, and explain to you guys how those bills do not actually support animal cruelty or the environment, but what they are implementing are strategies for the commons. Strategies for the commons laws. Strategies that say you do not have independent liberty, you have a communal right, but no independent liberty. And just remember that the people that are telling you you do not have independent liberty, the independent right to succeed, the independent right to prosper, the independent right to own a business, the independent right to own and control your own land that you paid for, are the people who are keeping that right for themselves, who bask in that right, who are convincing advocates to invest in their right, because they're going to take it from everybody else.
Because how do we call a liberal? You know, someone very profoundly once said many years ago that if fascism ever comes to America, it'll come in the name of liberalism. And what is fascism? Fascism is private ownership, private enterprise, but total government control and regulation. Well, isn't this the liberal philosophy? The conservative, so-called, is the one that says less government, get off my back, get out of my pocket, and let me have more control of my own destiny.
It is the most twisted economic policy I've ever seen. It is the most twisted social policy I've ever seen, but yet it's being pushed. And it's being pushed through advocate groups, because if you told an advocate, if you told a wildlife advocate, this farmer can't control this land and have his horses out on it anymore. This farmer can't fence off his property for his cows. This is going to be just left open for wildlife. They're gonna say, yeah, let's do it. If you told vegans, we're gonna do away with factory farms, we're gonna do away with any animal agriculture, then they're gonna say, yeah, let's do it. If you said, we're gonna support the small farmers by doing away with the big farmers and putting restrictions on what they can do, and we're gonna support the small farmers by making sure that they have a guaranteed income, and we're going to control that income and make sure that nobody can become rich off of farming, most of the community is going to catch on to the fact that we're helping small farmers. Yeah, cool. But that's not what these bills are doing. These bills are much more than that. Even the HERO bill that came out was pushing us in the direction of publicly owned banks. You get a debit card. You get government funds. You don't get private money. You don't get money that is managed by a private institution. You get funds that we give you. Now, if you trace back the history of currency, you know that there is no better way to control a society than through currency. Neither is there a better way to control a society than through having complete control over its food sources. Nobody's saying that we need to live in a completely unregulated society where everybody has a free-for-all like the Wild West. What I'm saying is that we need to protect the independent liberties, and we shouldn't be attacking those who have become prosperous. These cases in North Carolina were filed by individuals who didn't grow up in that house. They didn't buy that house centuries ago when these family farms were started that got sued and put out of business. They bought that house because it was an affordable home and they wanted to live there. They wanted to live in the country. You could buy affordable housing in a city, but then Lord knows you can't sue the city for noise pollution and make a ton of money, but you can move in next to a hog farm and sue them for offensive odors. I hardly notice the factory farms around us. I don't support factory farms. I don't like factory farms. I don't buy their meat. I'm also not somebody who is going to make a case and a ruling with a political law that is going to inhibit the rights of me from operating a farm or from my neighbor from operating a compost facility that's doing environmental good. I'm not going to enact a law that keeps people from being able to prosper off of their own land, to protect their own land, to hunt on their own land, to keep other people off of their own land. I'm not going to support any law like that. Just like I wouldn't support any law that bails the factory farms out. It is an avenue for opening a door. And if they can open that door and get the social acceptance behind it, they're going to do it. And once that door is open, it will not close.